I changed my daughter-in-law's seat on her wedding day. It was the most silent decision I ever made, and without a doubt, the coldest one they made in my life. Nobody noticed. Nobody questioned it. And most importantly, nobody knew why it mattered. What no one realized was that the chair she was meant to sit in had been prepared for something ugly. It wasn't decorative. It wasn't ceremonial. It was meant to embarrass my wife in front of a crowd that numbered in the hundreds. What nobody knew was that my own son had agreed to it and was ready to make sure it happened. And what absolutely no one imagined was that I had been watching everything unfold from the very start. That wedding cost over $200,000. But the filthiest thing that day wasn't on the ground, or in the sand, or hidden behind a tablecloth. It lived quietly inside people's intentions. Before I take you deeper into this, let me pause for just a second. If you're listening to this story from somewhere in the world, take a moment to subscribe and leave a comment telling me where you're tuning in from. It helps stories like this reach people who might need to hear them. Now let me take you back to that morning, when everything still looked flawless. I was sitting alone in the upstairs study of our estate in Monterey, California. From the wide window, I could see the ocean stretching endlessly under the early sun. Down below, rows of white chairs were lined up neatly on the beach. Light fabric drifted gently in the breeze, moving just enough to look romantic without seeming chaotic. Everything had been staged to feel effortless, like a dream you're supposed to remember forever. Soft rehearsal music played in the background, just loud enough to set a mood. It was the kind of sound that convinces people this is a happy day. But Eve lived long enough to know that the quietest days often hide the worst intentions. My family didn't come into money quickly. Our resort business was built slowly, after the war, one deal at a time, one sleepless night at a time. I spent most of my life believing in structure, discipline, and honoring what you promise. And through all of it, my wife, Margaret, stood behind me. She was never in magazines. Never gave speeches. Never cared to be noticed. But every meaningful decision I ever made carried her influence. She was the reason things stayed steady when the pressure hit. And somewhere along the way, I settled on a simple truth. If someone doesn't respect Margaret, they don't respect anything at all. My youngest son, Ethan, grew up surrounded by comfort. Still, he always felt like he deserved more. He had a habit of pointing in a direction and expecting others to absorb the cost. That habit never really left him. The first time Ethan brought Vanessa home, something didn't sit right with me. She smiled constantly, but it felt rehearsed. She said exactly what people expected to hear, no more and no less. And she held her phone like it was an extension of her hand, like silence bothered her. Margaret tried hard to welcome her. She asked thoughtful questions. She stepped aside when needed. Sometimes she even apologized for things that weren't her fault. I noticed all of it. And I noticed how easily Vanessa accepted that treatment, as if it were owed to her. This wedding wasn't something I wanted. Ethan and Vanessa came to me with a full proposal, complete with spreadsheets and presentations. The final cost crossed $200,000. They spoke about image, about branding, about how people needed to remember this day forever. Margaret stayed quiet. When I asked her opinion, she only nodded gently. She was always like that, choosing peace instead of conflict. I agreed, not because of the wedding itself, but because I believed, maybe foolishly, that this was our last chance to stand on the same side as a family. But as the date approached, things began to feel off. Vanessa avoided Margaret whenever possible. When they did speak, her smile never reached her eyes. Ethan grew tense and impatient, talking endlessly about what he deserved, about the future, about what would soon belong to him. I had heard those words before. But this time, they carried urgency. Greed doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. That morning, as preparations were underway, I passed by the bridal suite and heard laughter spilling out. The door was partially closed. I wasn't trying to listen, but when my wife's name came up clearly, my feet stopped on their own. Vanessa's voice was light, playful. She called Margaret an old wallet. Said women like her only belonged in the front row to ruin photos. Then she mentioned a surprise plan for later, something that made the entire room erupt with laughter. I stood there, my hand against the wall, feeling a chill creep up my arm. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't interrupt. I walked away like I'd heard nothing. In the service, I learned something important. Your first reaction is usually the wrong one. What unsettled me most wasn't Vanessa's cruelty. It was Ethan's silence. A silence that meant agreement. Back in the study, I stared out at the ocean for a long time. Margaret was downstairs, having her shawl adjusted by a friend. She looked calm, graceful, completely unaware. I asked myself how often kindness gets mistaken for weakness. How often patience gets confused with permission. Outside, everything continued to fall perfectly into place. But in my mind, the ground had already started to shift. And that was only the beginning. By late morning, the estate had come fully alive. Staff moved quickly across the grounds, radios crackling softly, shoes brushing over stone paths and sand. Every detail was being checked, then checked again. From the outside, it looked like a well-rehearsed performance, the kind that convinces guests everything is under control. But I've learned that control is often an illusion. Margaret was downstairs by then, standing near the terrace while a longtime friend adjusted her shawl. She looked composed, graceful in that quiet way that never asks for attention. If anyone deserved to be honored that day, it was her. Yet she moved through the morning like a guest instead of a pillar, smiling politely, staying out of the way. I watched her from a distance and felt something settle in my chest. Not anger. Something heavier. A sense of final clarity. I walked the ground slowly, not because I needed the exercise, but because I wanted to see everything with my own eyes. When a man reaches a certain age, he understands this much. The moments that matter most rarely announce themselves. They happen quietly, when no one thinks to look. The VIP seating area had been arranged close to the shoreline. The front row was reserved for family. Each chair held a small, elegant placard with a name written in clean lettering. Margaret's seat was there, perfectly placed, facing the aisle. At first glance, nothing seemed wrong. I might have walked away right then if I hadn't heard that laughter earlier. If I hadn't felt that tightening in my chest that comes when something doesn't align with the picture being presented. There were about 15 minutes left before the ceremony. That's when Vanessa appeared. She came from behind one of the decorative columns, still wearing her wedding dress, but with the veil removed. Her eyes scanned the area quickly, not nervously, but strategically, like someone checking for witnesses. She didn't see me standing half-hidden behind a pillar. She crouched beside the chair marked with Margaret's name. From a small handbag, she pulled out a clear bottle. Even from a distance, I recognized it instantly. Industrial adhesive. The kind meant for construction, not crafts. Not something a person brings along by accident. She twisted the cap slowly and applied a thick layer directly onto the seat. Not rushed. Not sloppy. Careful. Deliberate. I waited for anger to hit me. It didn't. What I felt instead was a calm, almost chilling certainty. Every word I had overheard earlier snapped into place like puzzle pieces I hadn't realized were missing. A few yards away, Ethan stood with his back turned, pretending to check his phone. His head tilted slightly, just enough to tell me he was listening. When Vanessa finished and capped the bottle, Ethan turned and smiled faintly. I couldn't hear everything they said, but I heard enough. He joked that his mother always liked attention. That this would teach her a lesson. That once everyone stood to applaud, the dress would take care of the rest. I didn't recognize my son in that moment. Not because of the words themselves, but because of how easily they came out. Calm. Casual. As if they were discussing table settings. Vanessa slipped the bottle back into her bag, smoothed her dress, and walked away without a second glance. Ethan followed her. He never looked back. I stood there for a few more seconds, watching the breeze lift the white ribbons tied to the chairs. Everything around me looked peaceful. No one noticed what had just happened. I knew that if I stepped forward then, if I shouted or confronted them, the day would explode into chaos. But chaos rarely brings truth. It just makes noise. I bent down near the chair. The glue was still wet. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. My years of military service came rushing back, lessons about restraint, about timing, about letting people reveal themselves through their own actions. The decision didn't take long. In fact, it felt like it had already been made the moment I heard Margaret's name spoken like a joke. I lifted the placard with her name from the chair. Slowly. Casually. No one paid attention. Then I walked to the head table where the bride's chair sat, positioned front and center, meant to command the room. I looked around. Everyone was busy. No one noticed an older man holding two small pieces of cardstock. I switched them. The chair with the adhesive now bore Vanessa's name. The clean chair returned to the family row, exactly where Margaret would sit. I adjusted the placement carefully, making sure nothing looked disturbed. When I stepped back, everything appeared flawless. No alarms. No stares. Just quiet certainty. A few minutes later, Margaret walked toward the family seating area. She smiled at me, warm and familiar, and sat down without hesitation. I nodded back, a reassurance she didn't even know she needed. The music began. Guests took their seats. Vanessa reappeared, veil in place, moving with confidence, like someone who believed every detail was under her control. I stayed near the back, watching. Some traps are built for others. And some are simply waiting for the person who set them. And with that, the ceremony began. The ceremony moved forward with a kind of polished perfection that almost felt artificial. Every cue was timed, every movement practiced. The music softened at the right moments. The officiant spoke with warmth that sounded convincing enough to anyone who hadn't been paying attention all morning. I stood toward the back, close enough to observe, far enough to avoid conversation. People shook hands, whispered compliments, smiled for photos. None of it reached me. Vanessa spoke her vows clearly and confidently, like someone reciting lines she'd rehearsed 100 times in front of a mirror. Ethan repeated his after her. His eyes drifted once toward the family row where Margaret sat, her posture straight, hands folded gently in her lap. Nothing happened. That calm told me everything. The moment hadn't arrived yet. When the applause ended the ceremony, I felt something press against the inside of my vest pocket. Earlier that morning, Ethan had asked me to hold on to some documents for him. He said his jacket was too tight, that he didn't want to wrinkle them. I hadn't questioned it then. As guests began to stand and turn toward the reception area, I slipped my hand into my pocket, meaning only to straighten the papers. But the texture felt wrong. Too stiff. Too deliberate. I'm not in the habit of reading other people's documents. But life doesn't always present its truths politely. I unfolded the first page. One glance at the signature was enough. It was my name. My signature. But it wasn't mine. The document was a provisional will attached to a transfer of usage rights for the Monterey estate. The effective date was listed clearly. Immediately following the wedding. Every line was worded carefully, just enough to pass a quick review. But I'd signed thousands of documents in my life. I knew my hand. This signature was heavier, uneven, rushed. A copy created by someone who wanted results more than accuracy. I folded the papers back into my pocket. The feeling that settled in my chest wasn't shock. It was confirmation. The laughter from the makeup room. The prepared chair. Ethan's impatience. It all pointed to the same truth. This wasn't about family. It was about ownership. The reception area glowed under warm lights. White tablecloths, polished glassware, floral arrangements that probably cost more than most people's cars. The head table sat slightly elevated, designed to draw every eye. I watched Vanessa approach her chair. The placard with her name rested neatly in front of it. She didn't look down. Didn't check. Confidence has a way of blinding people. Margaret sat at the family table, speaking quietly with a couple of guests. She looked more relaxed now than she had all morning. Watching her, I realized something important. Protection doesn't always happen in one dramatic moment. Sometimes it's the result of years of restraint finally reaching its limit. The MC took the stage and began his opening remarks. Vanessa stood, smiling broadly, waving like someone who'd grown comfortable in front of cameras. She spoke about love, about growth, about overcoming challenges together. Every sentence was polished, perfect for live streams and future highlights. Ethan stood beside her, one hand resting on the back of the chair. From time to time, his eyes flicked toward me, searching for approval. I offered none. As Vanessa spoke, the gap between image and intention became impossible to ignore. A person can speak beautifully about family while quietly preparing documents to steal from it. A person can wear white while planning to humiliate someone who never deserved it. When the speech ended, the MC invited Vanessa to sit so the next segment could begin, a commemorative video meant to stir emotion at just the right moment. She turned and lowered herself into the chair without hesitation. I watched closely, not because I wanted harm, but because every disguise eventually reaches its breaking point. The video started playing. Old photos filled the screen. Childhood moments. Beach trips. Laughter frozen in time. I heard soft sighs from the audience. I didn't look at the screen. I looked at Vanessa. She sat upright, hands resting neatly on her lap, unaware that the chair beneath her was holding tighter than any vow spoken minutes earlier. In my pocket, the forged documents rested like a weight I had carried long enough. I didn't know exactly when I would speak. I only knew that when I did, it would be once, and it would be enough. The MC's voice cut in gently, inviting the bride to stand for a special surprise prepared by friends. Vanessa smiled. She placed both hands on the chair and leaned forward, ready to rise. And then everything stopped. Vanessa leaned forward to stand, but her body didn't move the way it was supposed to. At first, the smile stayed on her face, frozen in place like it belonged to someone else. She tried again, pressing her hands harder against the edges of the chair. The movement was subtle, almost unnoticeable, except to the people sitting closest to the head table. A soft, unfamiliar sound followed. Not loud enough to alarm the room, but strange enough to turn a few heads. Ethan frowned and bent closer to her, whispering something under his breath. Vanessa shook her head slightly, her jaw tightening. She gripped the table edge, fingers whitening. The MC hesitated on stage, sensing something had gone wrong but unsure how to address it. He offered a weak joke, hoping to smooth the moment. No one laughed. Ethan placed his hand on Vanessa's shoulder and pulled gently. That's when the sound happened. It wasn't violent. It wasn't sudden. Just a dry, tearing noise that carried through the microphones in a room that had gone completely silent. The kind of sound that stays with you long after it fades. Vanessa gasped, not from pain, but from panic. She bent forward instinctively, trying to cover the part of the dress that had given way. Ethan froze, hands hovering in the air, unsure whether to pull again or let go. Every eye in the room turned toward the head table. Phones lifted out of habit, then lowered again as people realized this wasn't entertainment. This was something else. I stayed seated. Not because I felt detached, but because this moment didn't belong to movement. It belonged to stillness. Vanessa whispered urgently to Ethan. I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. Her hands trembled. Her confidence was gone. Ethan tried again, this time with more force. The tearing sound returned, clearer now. Vanessa broke down completely. Not the kind of crying meant for cameras, but the collapse of someone who had just realized she'd lost control of a situation she thought she owned. That was when I stood. The sound of my chair moving was small, but in that silence, it was enough. I walked toward the stage calmly and took the microphone from the MC's shaking hands. He didn't resist. He looked relieved. I'm sorry, I said evenly. I think we need to pause. The room went completely still. I turned my attention to Vanessa. Her makeup had begun to run. Her eyes were red, searching, afraid. Vanessa, I continued, keeping my voice steady, you once said this wedding needed to be unforgettable. I paused, letting the words settle. You were right. A murmur spread through the crowd. But before anyone calls this an accident, I went on, perhaps you should explain why the chair meant for my wife was coated with industrial adhesive and why my son was standing nearby to make sure it happened. The reaction was immediate. Gasps. Whispers. Chairs shifting. Ethan spun toward me, his face drained of color. Dad, he started, then stopped when he met my eyes. I wasn't angry. I didn't need to be. And since we're discussing preparation, I added, we should also talk about the documents Ethan asked me to hold this morning. I reached into my vest pocket and removed the folded papers, holding them up without opening them. That alone made Ethan take a step back. This, I said, is a will and a property transfer agreement. Written in my name. Signed with my signature. Carefully done, but not carefully enough. No one spoke. Beyond the walls, I could hear the ocean. Steady. Unbothered. Vanessa's gaze dropped from the chair beneath her to the papers in my hand, then to the torn fabric of her dress. The layers she had built for this day were falling apart one by one. I'm not here to humiliate anyone, I said, lowering the microphone slightly. I'm here because some jokes stop being jokes when they're meant to hurt. And some documents stop being mistakes when they're forged. I handed the microphone back to the MC and turned away. I didn't wait for reactions. I didn't need to. Everything that mattered was already visible.